Hello and welcome to the 6th video update on the What If interactive wargame campaign being run here at the Battle of Prestonpans Jacobite Museum in East Lothian. Now it's not all that long since our last video update and the siege of Newcastle-upon-Tyne is rumbling on, but as events have been taking place relatively quickly and because there seems to be the potential for a dramatic climax building, I thought it was important that we updated you on what's been taking place. So without further ado, let's get a bird's eye view of the table where the siege is currently underway. In the previous video, I took some time to explain the landscape of the battlefield, this being the Westgate area of the defences of Newcastle, the main defences being the main wall running to the Durham Tower there, the Westgate itself, the Pink Tower, and then over on the edge of our table over here, the 4th Postern Gate, which had been put in 1715. There's an area of suburbs in the centre of the battlefield which had been largely dismantled by the retreating redcoat forces of Marshal Wade as they'd entered the city. And as you can see at the bottom of the table, our Jacobite army has now settled in for the siege, established its siege camps, and has begun entrenching across the centre of the table. There are two principal Jacobite batteries mounted opposite the Westgate, where there are clear lines of sight despite the suburbs towards the castle walls. Now in our previous sieges at Stirling and Edinburgh in particular, there hadn't been any great pressure on the Jacobites as they'd sat in front of their enemy. Now, however, the situation is very different. The Prince's army is besieging Newcastle, but the Duke of Cumberland, with a very sizable body of men, is moving up towards him. So the Jacobites are under pressure and they need a swift conclusion to this siege unless they're going to be caught between the hammer and the anvil. Now, according to the house rules that we're playing to, the Jacobites could take as long as they want with this siege. They've already spent a week digging trenches and erecting batteries. The next phase, which has just begun, would allow them to bombard the city walls until, based on a daily dice roll, the walls were breached. Then they could choose either to assault the breach or to simply continue rolling the siege on. Eventually they'd move to a stage where there'd be a daily roll to see whether the garrison's morale and supplies could continue holding. But by this model, the siege could take weeks, like it did with the sieges of Stirling and Edinburgh. The Jacobites simply don't have weeks to wait. The Jacobites are also aware, of course, that even if they breach the walls, they're going to have a difficult task getting through the breaches, especially as the government does have cannon mounted into the towers overlooking any potential approach route. So the Jacobites have got to be cautious, because if they want to fight a battle after they've taken this city, they want to minimise their casualties. So the Jacobites are both trying to minimise casualties and minimise the amount of time they spend outside the city. Difficult task. Now the Jacobites, as I've said, have completed the first stage of the siege, which was the erection of their siege lines and their batteries, and they've done this at the very edge of the limit of the range of the guns mounted into the walls of Newcastle. Because of their previous victories, the Jacobites actually have a very substantial artillery train and are in a strong position here. But they know that even if they successfully breach these walls, they're going to have to deal with cannons mounted into the Durham Tower, the two towers of the Westgate, and the Pink Tower. That means that any assault into any breach that's made will be exposed to potentially devastating fire, especially as some of these assaults will have to go in column. So the Jacobites have the option of delaying the daily breach roll and fighting tactical gains instead, and that's what they've opted to do. It means that it might take longer for the breaches to be put into the walls, but that when the Jacobites are able to attack, they might do so with fewer casualties. That could be important. Delaying just a few days makes it more likely the Duke of Cumberland will come close for a battle, but by minimising casualties during the assault, they're in a better position to face him if he does. And so, on the 9th of December 1745, our Prince Charlie determines that he will not have a daily breach roll. Instead, he will launch a tactical attack in order to try and gain some advantage that will minimise casualties when the assault eventually has to go in. And he's focused that attack at a position on the battlefield known as the 4th. Now, those of you who remember the last video will recall from this 1720s plan of the city of Newcastle that the area that we're concerned with is this area of the defences in the west, centred on Westgate here, and at the extreme edge of our battlefield, a postern gate that was stuck in 1705. Unlike the mighty Westgate, the fourth postern, which you can see here in the engraving on the left, was not put in with defence in mind. It was rather to give convenient access for the citizens to some pleasure grounds outside the city wall. As such, we've assessed it to be a bit of a weakness in the defences, and Marshal Wade has placed the small unit of the Northumberland militia outside of the postern gate behind some wooden breastworks, as you can see on the right. Now, the fourth postern, which you see circled there, led through a tree-lined avenue to an area known as the Forth. The Forth was a 16th century tavern which had developed throughout the 17th century to quite a substantial place. There's an image of it on the right there. It was a meeting hall, a pub, a sports centre. The square enclosure in front of it was both a park, a drying green and a bowling green. So it was a popular spot, a beautiful spot, and a walled enclosure which is just outside the city walls. Naturally enough, we've therefore included it in our landscape. This is looking at it from the other way, from the townward side towards the Jacobite siege lines ahead. But you can see the tavern itself there and the walled bowling green area in front of it. We even noted in one reference the fact that benches had been provided for the infirm citizens to enjoy the pleasure of the parkland too. So now that we understand those features a bit better, I'll show you them on the battle table. There is the fourth postern, the tree-lined avenue leading towards the Forth, and of course the Forth Tavern and the bowling green right there. Now, the Jacobites have assessed that potentially this is an area which gives them access to a weak point in the enemy's defences. Now, it's not clear on this photograph, but there's a Jacobite cannon battery there which is able to fire on the town. But next to it there is also a battery of mortars, and those mortars are way out of range here. But if they were able to move those mortars forwards into the Forth area, then they could be within range of the Northumberland militia and the postern gate. Now this, if they could do it, would create a corridor that was controlled by the Jacobites, getting them close to the town walls. Now we have some special rules for this sort of action as part of a wider siege. Firstly, it will be controlled and limited therefore to only 8 simple turns. Because very few parts of the army will be engaged in the operation, those 8 turns will happen pretty rapidly. The second thing is that any casualties which are taken during these sorts of operations, they will carry over to the next phase of the siege. So if you take 3 casualties during this operation on a unit, then that unit will have those 3 casualties when the assault goes in or when the next operation begins. So that's a potential risk for both sides, and therefore something the attackers have to consider very carefully when committing forces into the operation. And finally, of course, that by choosing to launch an operation like this, the attackers sacrifice their daily breach roll. So whatever the outcome of the operation here, there will be another day added unto the action of the siege. Now, the action begins with the opening of batteries of cannon on the Jacobite siege lines, firing up the centre of the table towards, targeting very specifically the cannons that are mounted into those walls. The Jacobites have the advantage of numbers in terms of their artillery, but only if they get their mortars into play. Otherwise, it's 4 guns firing on 4 guns, and of course the walled guns and the entrenched guns are all benefiting from a degree of protection, and they're all firing at their extreme long range. So the initial battery fire is pretty ineffective in the first phase of the game. The guns mounted on the town walls return the Jacobite fire, but they have limited effects as well in the first phase of the operation. Using the Forth Tavern and its adjacent woodland as cover, the Jacobites do successfully get their mortars to the extreme edge of the Forth playing fields, but they're not able to quite get over the walls and into position yet. Those mortars also have a low stamina value, and of course as they move closer towards the enemy's guns, they're more likely to be exposed to their fire and potential destruction, neutralizing the whole point of the operation. So the Jacobites know they have to bring forward some infantry to screen the advance of their mortars as well. And so a regiment from Murray's division is brought forwards into the shadow of the 4th Tavern, ready to give them some protection. The Athelmen, in fact, end up moving quicker than the mortars themselves, and they get into the bowling green and take up a position looking down the tree-lined avenue. The Northumberland militia, meanwhile, had been looking on and seeing the advance of the mortars and sensing the potential danger, and since they were already outside of the walls, this was a moment where they thought they might be able to effect some form of heroism, which might reduce the Jacobite artillery dominance. But although the Northumberland militia had a successful set of orders, and so were able to get out of their breastworks and rush forwards towards the 4th, the Athelmen had got there before them. That meant that the Northumberland militia were now out in the open. They were only a small unit anyway, and their initial plan of being able to fire upon the mortars had been deterred by the advance of the Athelmen. Nevertheless, they did successfully put a nasty volley in against the mortar crews, not only inflicting a casualty, but disordering the mortar crews as well, meaning that they were slow in getting up into position. That gave enough time for the Northumberland militia, having felt they'd done enough for this morning, to retire back towards the walls before any great damage was done to them in return. As they withdrew, the Jacobites were able to consolidate their position in the 4th. They pulled back the Athelmen, there's Murray doing so just now, whilst the mortars finally were able to get into position after that disorder had been overcome. During the lull, the Northumberland militia had successfully returned unscathed to their original position, although now, of course, they came under mortar fire for the first time and began to take casualties themselves. The breastworks in front of the 4th postern were, of course, no safety against the fire from the mortars, and as their casualties began to mount, it was clear that the Northumberland militia faced either being destroyed without being able to fight back, or they needed to return through the gates of the city. And so, discretion being the better part of valour in this circumstance, the militia are brought by Marshal Wade back into Newcastle, and then they simply took up a defensive position in the gardens which backed up towards the wall at this point. So they might not be able to defend the 4th postern anymore, but they could certainly put a devastating fire into anybody who attempted to come through it. Now, like the gates, the outworks in front of the 4th postern had been given a building value, and although they'd now been abandoned, the Jacobites continued to target them with their mortars, so that the position would become untenable for any other force, and they no longer presented an obstacle for any potential Jacobite attack in that direction either. So this skirmish ends with success for the Jacobites. The Athelmen return to their position behind the 4th Tavern, where they are protected from the guns from the town walls, but they have left the mortars in position, in a strong position which they can subsequently entrench in the 4th bowling green. Those mortars have taken a casualty, but they've also dislodged the Northumberland militia and pushed them back inside the gate, destroying their outworks. A successful operation, if limited in its scope, nevertheless it potentially gives the Jacobites the opportunity to use the 4th as a staging post for future operations. And so the stage is set for the second operation the Jacobites launched against the walls on the 10th of December 1745. This time their aim is to destroy as many of the enemy's guns as they possibly can. The purpose, of course, being to make sure that when the Jacobite assault columns go in against the gates or breaches at a subsequent engagement, there's as little enemy artillery as possible to inflict casualties, which would roll over into any engagement with the Duke of Cumberland. Now, we assumed that during the night, since it's within range, the 4th Tavern would be largely destroyed by the battery fire from the enemy's walls, but the Jacobites have extended their trenches on this side so that there is a protected channel towards that position for any future infantry build-up. The main Jacobite batteries remain in the previous positions, 2 guns here 2 guns further across. And there is, in fact, over at extreme range again, another battery of mortars which the Jacobites might want to move forwards. Distressing though the loss of the 4th tavern might be to the citizens of Newcastle after the siege, the ruins of the castle and the entrenchments around it do at least continue to provide protection for the Athelmen, who are the furthest Jacobite unit forward other than the mortars in the Bowling Green themselves. Now the Jacobites actually have 2 batteries of field mortars in the siege. They've got the one that's occupied the 4th tavern, and they've got another battery on the opposite end of their line. But these are both out of range in terms of being able to shell any targets actually on the walls themselves, particularly the guns of the enemy. Now the Jacobites, as I've said, have got other guns in support, and if they were able to combine both their cannon and their mortars, they have a substantial advantage over the guns on the walls in terms of numbers and firepower. So they need to get those mortars up in range, and that is what this operation was designed to do. On both flanks of the Jacobite siege line, move the mortars forwards so that they can bring their shells against the enemy's emplaced cannon. Now, in bringing their mortars forwards at both ends of the line, they come uncovered by the Jacobite defensive works, and so it now is a race to see whether the Jacobites can dislodge the wall's cannons before the wall's cannons can destroy the Jacobite mortar batteries. The Jacobites have successful order rolls at both ends of the battle line, so they do successfully get their mortars up into range, but of course that means they are both exposed to the enemy's fire. Now, it might not be the most exciting gameplay, but the Jacobites know that this battery and counter-battery fire works to their advantage, because as soon as one gun is taken out, then the advantage begins to very dramatically build in the Jacobite favour. And casualties on both sides do start to mount, but by focusing and targeting their batteries, the Jacobites start to make an impression. Nevertheless, those mortar batteries do feel very exposed. The Duke of Perth here having to ride forwards of his lines in order to rally off casualties to try and keep the casualties minimised. The advantage being that this is now a static exchange of fire, meaning that ordered rolls are not needed for movement. Eventually, the first of Wade's guns is silenced. That's that on the Durham Tower on the north side of the battlefield. And it's closely followed by the Pink Tower as well, which is heavily exposed to the shells from the mortars that have advanced forwards from the 4th tavern. Once the Pink Tower goes, then it is very much a Jacobite-dominated battlefield, and all of the Jacobite guns and mortars are able to target the 2 towers of the West Gate. Eventually, the southernmost of those is also silenced. And at that point, the only thing within range of the mortars near the 4th tavern is Pulteney's regiment mounted on this stretch of wall. Those soldiers there, unable to fire back because the enemy are out of range, start to take hits from the mortar shells and their casualties begin to mount. With heavy casualties, Pulteney's pulled back off the wall successfully, and Marshal Wade brings them into the town. And then, fearing that the same might happen to Barrel's regiment further along the line, he also withdraws them from the wall and brings them down into the grounds of Blackfriars Priory. So, as the operation comes to an end on turn 8, the Jacobites are again successful. They've dislodged Pulteney's and Barrel's regiments from the walls, not expectedly, but at least the latter got off without any casualties. The Jacobites have also dismounted the guns on the Durham Tower and the Pink Tower and the southern tower of the West Gate. They've suffered some casualties, though, amongst their mortar batteries. Perhaps that doesn't matter, as they've done most of their work. The one qualification to the Jacobite victory, though, is that there is still a remaining cannon emplaced on the West Gate, which means that any central Jacobite assault will have to run through the teeth of that artillery fire. But I suppose at least one gun is easier to charge than 4. So the Jacobites have successfully moved their mortars forwards on both flanks and therefore secured dominance of the flanking areas of the table, the open spaces, and they've successfully knocked out 3 of the guns on the walls, but they have not knocked out the 4th, which still controls the central area through which any potential Jacobite attack on the gate is going to have to travel. Now the Jacobite batteries are going to take some time, unopposed by their opponents, to batter away at the walls and hopefully effect a breach. And they need that breach to come soon. Because whilst all this has been happening, the Duke of Cumberland has continued his advance towards Newcastle. Now the Jacobites might have a couple of days' grace, because Cumberland, in order to move so fast, has divided his army into several columns. He will have to stop for several days to allow his rearguard to catch up before he can offer battle to the enemy. So the Jacobites have less than a week in order to either assault the walls of the city or move away from Newcastle and seek a battlefield where they can face Cumberland to their advantage. Will they risk waiting for a breach? Will they risk assaulting that breach? Will Cumberland move up and force them away from the city? Let's wait and see. Fortunately, I don't think we'll have to wait too long. The campaign, as you'll remember, is being fought in real time, and every day takes us closer, I think, to a decisive action. Thanks for watching.